context, personal ministry context, that there was just this drive to quote unquote get back to normal. But what did that actually mean? And for a lot of ministries and churches, it meant, getting back to all of the things that we were doing, without perhaps a recognition of the pause that we were actually given during the pandemic, or actually even the need for a pause. And the way I approached it was the need for rest, or the idea of what does it look like for us as church ministries and communities to reclaim rest, as something that is beneficial for teens and for youth. So it's based on studies and surveys that people have done. They didn't really address rest in terms of a broad topic, but they approach it in terms of sleep, or the need for sleep. And this is both, this is pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. They found that teens were not getting enough rest. That even though the recommended amount of sleep for teens was 8 to 9 hours, they weren't getting that. And that was pre-pandemic too. And a big culprit of the reason why they weren't getting that rest was attachment to technology, and the fact that they were still on their screens, even though they had gone to bed. And it's something we'll talk about later too. In addition to that, the pandemic introduced disruptions to sleep patterns, the disruptions to their ability to rest. A lot of that was due to the fact that there were a lot of new stressors, new sources of stress for youth. So whether it's losing family members or just worrying about the future, all of these things were contributing to this disruption of sleep and rest patterns. And there was but there was an opportunity presented here during the pandemic, that there was a pause, and the pause, or the forced lockdowns, and the fact that teens couldn't go to school, then families didn't have meetings, parents didn't have to go to work anymore. This pause presented actually an opportunity for some teens, at least, or some families, to reclaim some healthy rhythms that included more sleep or more rest. And also provided an opportunity for teens to disengage in a positive way. That if they had stressors or sources of stress in school, and their relationships at school, or just the pressures for academic pressures, they were able to disengage from that. So there were some positives that resulted from the lockdown and the pauses of the pandemic, and that's kind of where I continue to take it in terms of the need for rest, and what are some of the things that we learned from the pandemic in terms of rest. But as we're talking about reclaiming rest, or as we're talking about, what does it mean for churches to be a source of rest and Sabbath rest? What does that mean for us? I kind of took a look at the nature of rest too, that, and this is even pre-pandemic, this idea of, we're in a meritocracy, right? That being busy is good, achieving is good, producing is good. And for youth, they're feeling this too. And especially in terms of their connectivity to social media and technology, which they're using during their leisure time, right? Times when they're supposed to be getting some rest, times when they're supposed to be able to disengage or detach from the stressors or the sources of burden, that they're constantly seeing the things that everyone else is doing. So they're feeling this pressure to keep up, or they're feeling this pressure to stay busy. And even if they weren't busy, they felt like they had to give off the appearance of being busy. So even during those times of leisure, during those times when they really didn't have to do anything, the fact that they were constantly connected was a source of constant pressure, that there wasn't even rest there. So what does it look like then for teens who are in this culture of busyness, culture of achievement? They constantly have this pressure to produce, and even the social media in terms of their relationships and comparing themselves to other people. What does it look like for the church to begin to reclaim and reframe rest, and just thinking about it in terms of the Sabbath? Unfortunately, many churches are contributing to the problem, that even for churches, in terms of the church being institutionalized, that there's still this prevalent idea of production, We have to get people in the door. We have to think about attendance. We have to think about church growth, where all the things that we have to do, all the ministries and programs we have to get in place in order to grow the church and grow the ministry. So even within the church, where there should be a healthy space for rest, and at the very least a healthy definition of rest, there doesn't seem to be that. In the book Wrestling for Rest, the author Nathan Stuckey, he has several great stories, anecdotes from teens who say that even in the church environment, they're feeling this pressure of keeping up, right? And these are student leaders.
1
But
minute.
what does it look like for us to go back to the definition of rest, this biblical idea of stopping and to desist, that this would create an opportunity for teens to find relief from the constant pressure and the constant connection, that they're able to detach from all the stressors post-pandemic, and all the things that they're feeling. And it's related to this idea of creating a space of pausing and stopping and desisting to allow cultivation to happen. And this is from Susan Phillips' book, A Cultivated Life, where the idea is part of the positive effects of rest and Sabbath rest is the idea of pausing from ministries and things like that, is allowing things like discipleship relationships and mentoring to really take root and to develop, so that people can actually invest in relationships, because we're willing to kind of stop all of the busyness and all the other stuff. And there actually was a study done on faith-driven methods of coping, helping teens to cope with COVID-19 stress, and it was talking about faith-driven coping as opposed to fear-driven coping. So for teens, in terms of busyness, it's this fear of, I need to keep up. Can we as churches provide a space where teens can actually find that respite and focus on their faith and rely on their faith to respond and cope to stressors and situations, and to have that ability to release, whether it's discipleship relationships kind of informing that, or them just being present in the midst of the people of God, and just having that opportunity to just disconnect and to detach and find that rest and relief. So yeah, that's the paper. Go get it. Rest. Just, what are the conversations that we as church communities and ministries and church leaders need to kind of begin to have, in order to kind of create the space for rest that teens need.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Really important topic, especially post-pandemic, as you've identified. I think we have a time for a couple of short I likes, I wonders.
I see a couple of questions here. Yeah, Drew. I think I kind of wrestle with that a little bit in terms of the end of the paper, where it's like, oh, I could have 5 points. How can churches lead youth in terms of rest? But then I'm like, well, is that just contributing to the problem, right? Is that another thing that's prescriptive, kind of adding to this idea of busyness and muddying the conversation with busyness a little bit? Yeah. Sabbath Sunday.
Another one. Amanda's got one in the chat here.
That's awesome. Recently, I started at my church currently, just started in September, and I said, you know what, during the Christmas break, for 2 weeks, we're not going to have any kind of youth ministry programming, because the leaders need rest, the youth need to disconnect a little bit, just to get away from the busyness of church. And of course, naturally, I had a youth leader go, well, if we're not meeting formally, what are some informal ways that we're going to meet? And I'm like, but that's defeating the purpose of the rest. I know what you're trying to say. It's not so much let's just kind of hang out with the youth. It's like, what's another thing we can do in place of the formal meeting? So yeah, I think it's great that you're able to have that Sabbath Sunday. We don't have any programming. But I think for my church and just a lot of churches and ministries, it's a long way to go, I think, to kind of fight this urge to produce, right?
Absolutely. Will, thanks, appreciate it. Josh asked a question in the chat as well. I'll let you guys interact with that just out of respect for time, but great stuff. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Kelsey, you are up, and we have Sam on deck.
Hello, friends. Great to see you all again. All right. Oh. Slideshow. All right. I think, knock on wood, we're good. All right, my paper is on learner-centered authentic relational ministry. I got here through a tumultuous road, but I made it to this topic. Yeah, here we are. That's what I'm going to say about that. My paper is grounded in a feeling from surviving the pandemic through ministry, right? And having a feeling of burnout. And what does that mean? And what do we do? And recentering it on youth, right? Youth-centered youth ministry. 1 in 10 young people were personally contacted by a ministry leader during the pandemic, a statistic from Springtide Research. Only 1 in 10 young people were personally contacted by a ministry leader during the pandemic. 90% of young people were not, from the people they were surveying. That's insane. Ministry in the pandemic was chaotic. It was also a time of trying to do events and programmings virtually instead of really connecting authentically with youth, saying, how are you? How's it going? What can I do with you? How can I pray for you? Personally, my attention was drawn to setting up worship and then the live stream and then all this other stuff and trying to fit all these programmatic pieces into a time when kids were overwhelmed with already doing virtual stuff. We are program, not person focused as youth ministry. Andrew Root reminds us that youth ministry is a consumer product in his book, End of Youth Ministry. It shouldn't be a consumer product. That's not what youth ministry is for. That's not what Christ is for. Christ is here to walk in relationship with us. And so ministry shouldn't be about a numbers game, but it is. Congregations measure the success of a youth program based on how many butts are in the seats, not how many youth have a deep relationship with God. Youth ministry has become about having the best program with the newest curriculum, but that kind of youth ministry is not person youth-centered. It does not care about the youth and their faith in Christ. What are we going to do about that? We should use the learner-centered ministry model for youth ministry. This model can create a youth-centered ministry instead of a program-centered ministry. Youth and their life experiences are at the center of learning and gives them opportunity for critical thinking. This model, as in our readings from this year, talks about creating a deep and transformational learning, specifically in classroom settings. But I think if we translate this into a ministry model, it can and should and will create deep and transformational faith in youth. Youth ministers want faith to be deep and transformational, and a learner-centered ministry model gives that space and creates that space for youth to interact with God, with theology through their and others' lived experiences. Oh, I went too fast. Relational ministry is another way that we should do this. This should be the foundation of the learner-centered model. Relational ministry is not new. Hopefully you've heard of this before, but it is in fact not the current foundation of ministry. It is lost. So let's get back to the basics. We need to be authentic and relational with our youth. We need to be genuinely caring, honest, and open with young people. They can tell when we are BSing. And right now, I think we're just kind of walking the line of we're doing our jobs and giving you programs, but we're not being presently there with you. So we need to break down those walls to create connection. This should be done through accompaniment or place sharing, as Andrew Root talks about, in walking alongside and supporting and empathizing with the youth, trying to understand their lived experiences of pain and triumphs, and helping them use critical thinking and create deep theological understanding through those lived experiences, using your relationship with the learner-centered model to create this deep transformational faith in youth. Charlotte McCordale writes that accompaniment is the understanding of lived experiences of young people so that they can encounter Christ. This understanding of relational ministry is being Christ's example in the world. Christ wasn't about the programs, he wasn't about the newest curriculum, right? He was about being present with people who needed him and who didn't know who needed him, and yet they did. It's not
2 minutes.
Empathy is another way that we should be doing this with listening. It's about being intentional with young people and with our youth, listening to their emotions and not trying to fix an issue, not trying to fix something, but just being present and listening with them. Mentoring is a great example of an authentic relational learner-centered ministry. Mentors facilitate and it help explore a theme or topic based on a mentee's life experiences. This is the learner-centered teaching, learner-centered model. It is a long-term relationship. It's not just a youth group evening relationship connection, right? It's a long-term relational, deep connection with someone else to explore a topic, in this case, mentor-mentee faith relationship. Let's not forget that ministry is infinitely more about connection than production. Mary Estate says in Mark Osterreicher's book, youth ministry must become youth-centered again by getting back to the core of youth ministry, authentic relational ministry. And learner-centered model will guide youth ministry leaders to a youth-centered ministry so they can grow in a deep relationship with Christ.
Sorry, I had a problem with my mute. Amanda, Kelsey, great. That was just fantastic. Thank you for this, a really important topic, this idea of a learner-centered youth ministry. And I love what you're thinking about with regards to our responsibility to that. So let's open it up. I wonder. Any thoughts? Yeah, Amanda.
Kelsey, I totally agree. I wonder how we articulate, and I'll say I feel like I've been trying to do this my own ministry, and it's hard to get everybody to get it. How we articulate that to churches when they're so set on numbers and programs.
Yeah. I'm intrigued by this because of the pandemic and the fact that we had a moment of stillness, and yet there was still only 1 in 10 youth who were reached out to, right? We were given this moment of stillness, and yet we still didn't take advantage of it. That astounds me. That's all.
I guess I also wonder if you found anything in the research that seemed to imply, I don't know quite how to say it, like a fearfulness of relationship. Like I guess I wonder if some of the reason we jump to the programmatic is we've lost the ability to be in relationship. Like we hide behind programs because that's actually feels easier than being in relationship. I just wonder how that impacts kind of what you're thinking about.
Yeah, I haven't come across that in my research. It was more about the busyness and not having the space or the time for that relationship, right? Because we're just put into these large group and small group models, and you're given all these people at all these different times, and it's not this one-on-one person long-term relationship that you're connected with. You're just always like pushed towards someone else to do something else, to learn something else.
I wonder if part of the reason we have trouble with adults connecting with young people is a lot of our litigious society. I know I'm working with the church that's creating a mentoring program, and we've had to talk a lot about, well, permission slips and boundaries and where we can meet and where we can't meet. And there's fear and frustration that go along with that, trying to pair adults and young people up.
Yeah, that was sorry.
Go ahead. Casey.
That was one of my, where does this go from here, right? The youth minister should not be the only person doing this because we're one person who can't reach all the youth. But we need to start somewhere, right? And so it starts with us. And then we're able to then go out and make mentors and mentees and disciples to go and do this work with others. But we have to start somewhere, and it starts with us because we can take this back and be like, this is what we're going to do.
I almost feel like it starts with the job description, right? Like right from the beginning, like how are we defining what this role is, right? I mean, I think I know you're leaning toward this idea, but I think those are the fundamental questions, right? I think that's a real challenge. It's a shot over the bow to probably the way that we've even brought people on. So Kelsey, thanks for that. Really, really good and important things to think about. Okay, let's see. I gotta look at my list here. Okay, Sam is up and Jesse is on deck.
Sweet. All right. Cool. So, yeah, covenanting communities, the place of belonging. So, a focus for me here was on the whole concept of belonging and young people. Obviously, you cannot split apart identity and purpose from belonging. And in my paper, I sort of wrestle a little bit with that, but then just pretend as though you can, and we'll just focus on belonging. Yeah. And so what I was wrestling with was this thing of what Derek Tidball calls aerosol words. And belonging is one of those kinds of words. He was focusing as well on the word community, which obviously community and belonging very much tied in, linked in together. And his whole thing is that, you know, some of these words have just become aerosol words. We talk about community, we talk about belonging, but it's just sort of being sprayed around in the air, and then it very quickly just dissipates. And we're not necessarily grappling enough with what that actually means for us and for young people. We're not necessarily putting in place how we actually are going to measure the outcomes or how we expect these kinds of words to actually play out. And so that was sort of where I began my thinking around this whole idea of belonging. And because I work within a denominational college, so I work for the New Zealand Baptist Union at our college, and training people mostly into New Zealand Baptist contexts. And just FYI, we are not like the Southern Baptists. Apologies to any of my Southern Baptist friends, but just so that you're aware, not at all associated with the Southern Baptists. Very much sent me into kind of history around separatists and you know, these kind of agitators within the tradition. And so that was where I kind of went with what did they think about belonging, and what does that then maybe mean for us in youth ministry? And that's how I came to the whole thing of the concept of covenanting communities, and that within Baptist theology and ecclesiology, the covenant to one another and the covenant to God, so the vertical and horizontal aspects of covenant are absolutely crucial, and that creates all kinds of new and wonderful layers of being the church together if we take seriously the covenanting nature. And so Paul Fiddes is more recently the person that is the theologian who has developed this whole idea of covenanting communities. So I focused a lot on his work and on how he sees this developed over history and also continuing to develop today. And he plays that out through kind of the gathered nature of discipleship, that, you know, these things can't be done alone. He plays out an ecclesiology within the life of Baptist churches, ecclesiology of participation rather than observance or imitation, and just what that means in terms of mission and ministry, and therefore of belonging, because there's something that you're actually called toward as well in terms of an outcome in what you're being a part of. So this whole concept of covenanting communities, the idea of a gathered nature of discipleship, and the idea of an ecclesiology of participation, these were some of the things that in my paper I play around with in terms of how that impacts on young people's experience of belonging within the life of the church. And so then really it gets to a point where you have to say, so, what does this actually mean for us? And so here's just a few things here where I explore in my paper that we have to be able to make sure that this is much more than a spray and walk away mentality with belonging, that actually we take very seriously how important belonging is for young people, for all of us, right? Obviously, but for those of us that work within the sphere of young people, they're the most important, let's be honest. But also that belonging as they're going through the adolescent phase is absolutely vital for them. So that's a section that I look at in my paper. And that, we have to be able to get beyond the spray and walk away mentality. I don't know if you guys know that phrase at all. That's like a phrase from an advert over here for a cleaning product. There's this whole thing like spray and walk away. Anyway, in my context, there's this thing, the nature of whakawhanaungatanga, and that comes out of a Te Ao Māori perspective, and that's to do with the process of connecting together, like a kinship kind of connection among people. And so in my context, that is an absolutely vital part of what covenanting communities could actually look like, is this real flat line kind of kinship connection through the process of whakawhanaungatanga. And so that I think is unique to our context, but also not necessarily exclusive. I explore a little bit about the value of program. Program is really important. Obviously, we've all just heard that the authentic ministry is relational, and so yes, absolutely, relationships are crucial too. But just how actually programs can create much more longer-term, sustained processes as well, and give some structure to belonging. Obviously, not taking away the importance of relationship there either. And then just what does long-term commitment look like in a short-term world? This was something that I came across several times in the research, was just how young people are experiencing such short-term commitments from agencies, from friendships, social media, all of this sort of stuff. The news cycle is shorter and shorter. They're just experiencing such short-term commitments within their lives. So what does it look like for the church as a covenanting community to take very seriously a long-term commitment for young people? And how do we express that? I'm aware I've got 1 more minute, so here's my one more slide. So this was my original kind of thought, my original thesis, and I wanted to share it last, just to say that for me at least, and again, this is my context in what I am working, I have found that the Baptist concept of covenanting communities gives language and substance to the adolescent pursuit for belonging and brings a unique perspective to the purpose of youth ministry in Aotearoa, New Zealand Baptist churches. And so that was where I started, and I'm reasonably happy with the fact that I'm still sitting there, and I think it has played out. Maybe I twisted the research, I'm not sure. Let's just say that I didn't. We'll just say that it definitely was an actual thing. So yeah, thanks. I wonder.
Thanks, Sam. I wonder.
Sam, can you really quick, I guess I wonder the definition, the meaning of the word that sounded like a curse word that was really important in your presentation. Could you just define that real quick again?
Yep, sure. So whakawhanaungatanga is a Te Ao Māori word, so the indigenous people of New Zealand, and let me read out an actual thing here. So it's to do with a sense of family connection. It involves hospitality and unconditional love, but it's more the process of making connections across generations, across people. It's kind of a leveling of relationships at a kinship level, but it's the process of doing that and the ongoing process and the nature of those relationships. Mm-hmm. So like I said, it's not exclusive, obviously, to our context, but it sits very deep as a value within our context. Yeah.
And so that would be a commonplace, like a phrase, a word people would. Okay, very cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sweet.
Other thoughts or questions?
I really love the idea of covenanting relationships coming from the Reformed denomination. We use that language all the time,
Yeah.
from infant baptism to, I can remember the time when my daughter was baptized and watching the church like make these covenant, like it's such a beautiful thing. And I sincerely, I wonder, is that language, like covenant relationships, is that like commonplace in Baptist theology in New Zealand? That's just a curiosity of mine, because I don't hear many from the Baptist denomination use that language here.
Yeah. So we definitely we tie back more closely to the British Baptist kind of union, and they much more so that covenanting language. Interestingly, it sometimes gets boiled down to like church membership and that being the thing, and so then we've had instances recently where people, send an email to the eldership to say, I'm leaving because you guys have said something that I think is unbiblical, goodbye. It's like, wow, that's the extent of your covenanting with us, like that you think you can just now leave the relationship via email. So I'm not pretending that it's perfect, but yeah, definitely there is a much deeper sense, I think, here in New Zealand around covenanting communities in the Baptist life. But yes, needs work for sure.
The concept that you're turning, Sam, makes me feel like it's almost easier to become connected to community and harder to leave it, which
Yeah.
it seems like that's the goal, right?
That is, yeah, that's sort of what I'm playing with. I happen to be leading our local youth ministry at the moment too. We don't have a youth pastor or anything. And so that's what our leadership team, we're just talking constantly about belonging and what that actually looks like for young people to actually not be able to just ditch out. That there's something that's holding them that is beyond themselves within what we're doing.
It's really beautiful. Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it. Great work.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've got Jesse up next, and then Stacy's on deck.
It is making me open up my system preferences for some reason. Hold on 1 second. There we go. Let's try this again. Sorry, y'all. Okay, let me try it again. There we go. Okay, here we go. Okay. My paper is called Clarity is Kindness. Let me get rid of this box right here so I can see my presentation. Sorry. Well, I guess I'm not going to get rid of it. All right. Well, clarity is kindness. There is a good chance that there are gay people in your youth group or young adult ministry. The UCLA Williams Institute released a study last year that 9.5% of teenagers are identifying with one of the letters, LGBTQ. Gallup released a study last year as well, found that 1 in 5 Gen Z are self-identifying with one of the letters, which is double from the previous millennial generation, which was 1 in 10. Pastors and youth leaders are unclear often in how to shepherd and care for sexual minorities. Why are youth leaders unclear? Well, there are many different church models out there. And when I say church model, I mean like what a church believes and how they live out those beliefs in the ecclesiological life of the church. Culture is also complex. Things are changing often when it comes to LGBTQ identity and understanding and terms and what it all means. So it can all just be very overwhelming and complex. Often in churches with leaders, the beliefs are hidden, or the practices are hidden, or they just don't know how to talk about it. They're confused, which can lead to downstream bait and switch moments and just really hurtful and painful experiences for sexual minorities. Particularly for youth, they don't have the luxury of being able to just change to a different church, as adults often can just switch churches if they want to. And so it can be a missiological hope to to share with young people that there's different kinds of churches out there that view these things differently and handle these things differently, and that they can maybe change churches and find a church that will be a better fit down the road. It can provide hope. Andrew Marin, his research found that 54% of LGBT will leave the church by age 18, but 76 are open to returning to church. The goal is to have clarity around belief and practice. So I offer 5 models and 3 themes around these models. The first theme is the biblical rationale for each model. First, and so the 5 are from affirming to banishment. So the first one is full affirming side A leadership, which believes that covenantal, monogamous, same-sex marriage is affirmed by God, and you can be in full ministry. Some of the rationale is that what was happening in the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, is not the same thing. It's not talking about the same thing that we're talking about today. Descriptive versus prescriptive and cultural distance are some of the rationale in this position. So the next one is low buffer side B, church leadership. Oh, I forgot to mention, I intentionally am focusing on the leadership of these different models because the leaders often determine the church, what it believes and how it's going to play itself out. So low buffer side B leadership. Side B leadership believes in traditional marriage but separates attraction from behavior. The buffer refers to how hard or easy it is to be a part of the different aspects of the ecclesiological life of the church. Low means it's easier to get it, to be a part of those practices, and often in this model, the idea is like you will belong in these different places before you need to believe. Often these are mega churches, non-denominational churches, or urban churches that have high transient populations. The next one is high buffer, side B leadership. Also traditional view of marriage, separate attraction from behavior, that's the side B component. But the high buffer refers to it's harder to get into the different elements of the community and the ecclesiological life. You need to believe before you belong. These are often more tight-knit communities where, and there's an emphasis on upfront clarity. So like you'll have a membership with clarity of theology, moral expectations, and ecclesiological expectations before you can do some of the other things. The next one is ex-gay, side X leadership. The rationale is that you cannot be gay and Christian. Those two things cannot go together. That same-sex attraction is sinful. And so this is where you get conversion therapy concepts. These churches often will believe in supernatural healing or cure of same-sex attraction, and you'll hear like pray away the gay. They'll pray for a cure to heterosexual life. And then the last one is banishment leadership. This church model is trying to preserve the church integrity so that the sin does not spread throughout the congregation and the church. They will reject you. You're kind of banished until you repent, are cured, and then you can be welcomed back.
Jesse,
two,
1 minute. 1 minute,
Oh,
Jesse.
great. A grid of welcome practices. So you can just kind of see those practices there based on Sunday attendance, event attendance, communion, baptism, membership, serving, and church leadership or staff. So shaping church culture to a culture of care. There's 4 ideas. Number 1, leading a congregation to adapt. Leaders need to set the culture. We need to help see LGBTQ people like any other people who need to be cared and shepherded. Number 2 is creating a youth culture of care for LGBT youth. The church needs to be the safest place to talk about anything, including SSA. Marco fully agrees with that statement. So a place of question asking, an open dialogue, judgment-free space to experience Jesus in. The third is caring for the emotional health of LGBT youth. Trevor Project released a thing last year that in California, and I'm in California, under half of the LGBTQ youth had suicidal ideation, and over half anxiety and depression. And so I have much more on that, but we're going to move on. Number 4 is a positive vision for hope for LGBTQ youth in church. And the idea here is that we need to be a gospel spiritual family for, and so clarity is kindness. One of my questions that I don't feel is being addressed by anything that I really read is, can a Side B church care for Side A Christians? And if so, how? So thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jesse. Great topic. We know this is an important one to you, and we love the way you keep bringing it back and are turning it and thinking about it. So good job. Okay, I wonder.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I mean, I just like this topic because, as Steve just said, I think this is a massive one that we're going to keep wrestling with, especially in youth spheres, but in different kinds of ways. I wondered, on your graph with the sort of welcoming practices or whatever, like the banishment one. So there's nothing there. Was that like, were you surprised by that? That like there was just no real sense of a welcoming stance, even in that particular perspective of a biblical approach? Like, yeah, what?
Yeah, the scriptures that they would kind of refer to is like remove the sinful person and release them to Satan, and so make them leave the church. And so really that list of ecclesiological practices are all in the church, and so it's like you remove them until they come back. I had like 3 different things, that assumptions for that graph. I didn't get into them. One of them is that this is for a Side A gay Christian or LGBT Christian who is active in their relationship, and so because you could be a Side B Christian and be a pastor, Side B gay Christian and be a pastor in A, B, or X. So, anyways, great question.
Hey Jesse, I was curious if anything came up. Great work. That was really helpful in just even creating the clarity with the graph. And I was curious if wondering if there was anything on like the response of someone who identifies as LGBTQ, and how in the difference between like a high buffer Side B and a low buffer, where maybe it's further down the line, like was there anything on like they were more hurt because they were like already embedded and then this comes out, versus not like hurt up front? I don't know. I was just kind of curious about that, like the topic kind of talks about that, but I was curious if you came across any like stories that compared the two.
Yes, and I get into this in the paper more thoroughly, but yes, there's upsides and downsides to the high or low buffer, and one of the downsides of the low buffer is that someone can belong, often in low buffer kind of churches, they will avoid the discussion in general and around sexuality and sexual ethic, and so we'll get down the road and want to get married or want to join leadership or want to, whatever that may look like, and then we'll get that feeling of bait and switch. And so that's one of the downsides. Yeah, and lots of stories. There's so much great authorship and writing and research being done around this. And so, yes, there's tons of great stories and painful and heartbreaking stories.
I think as you turn this, I think your idea of buffer is interesting, because I think it shifts the continuum from just the theological continuum, which I think in some ways is kind of static. Like you're not. I think this is what you're wrestling with too. Is like, where do you fall in that, and how do you do that? And you made me think of like, what if we like turn the continuum and talked about like congruent churches and particular churches? And what do I mean by that is like, do some churches treat divorce and remarriage the same way they treat, sexual orientation, right? So for example, your example, if a gay person is expelled from the church because of something they've done according to their orientation, would a divorced person be expelled from the church? And if not, what's the difference, right? And so it'd be interesting to see does this issue become the only issue of which everything pivots, or is this consistent with churches? And so it's almost a continuum of consistency versus inconsistency, and then a continuum within that. And I wonder if there's a teachable way to look at that, to call people to a congruency in their theology, rather than perhaps, and Jesse, you're so careful with this, of pulling out a particular issue, or as some churches would say, a sin, as compared to something else. Like if two heterosexual people slept together who were single, would they be expelled from the church, right? So it's just interesting that I think sometimes churches want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to get rid of some things, but not others. And we all have our particularities when it comes to that. And I know it's more complicated than that, but it'd be interesting to, maybe you can create like your own continuum, right? I think that's what you're trying.
A whole section in the paper around hypocrisy. And I think the book you had us read a couple years ago, Unclean, and that idea of disgust is part of that, picking and choosing which are worse and better based on, all that. So yeah. I like having a consistent sexual ethic and not being is so important. And I fight hard for that in a lot of cases. Yeah.
Well, thanks for going there, and thanks for bringing that. Really appreciate it, Jesse. Yeah. Okay, one more for this section. We've got Stacy.
All right, so my university is part of the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, and all of these universities are committed to more than academic excellence and degree completion. We want to see students' lives transformed through Christ as they develop into well-rounded individuals who experience the fullness of life, a meaningful life in all of the multiple and overlapping domains of life. So we care not just about academics and spirituality, but that they thrive mentally, emotionally, socially, financially, vocationally, in leadership, in character. We care about their overall well-being. Unfortunately, research is showing us that many post-secondary students are not experiencing a level of well-being that will enable them to thrive in academic settings and reach their full potential. So what's all impacting well-being? Well, a couple big hitters are these. Mental health. We know that the mental health of young people in the United States has been declared a national emergency. So all of these things plus more impact mental health. Mental health impacts well-being. There are psychological needs that research has found impact well-being, including autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And then additionally, belonging and purpose and social support all influence well-being. So after looking at all of these factors that influence well-being, I turned my attention to the practice of coaching and the values of coaching to see if the theory of coaching would intersect with the needs that emerging adults have when it comes to well-being. So while executive coaching doesn't have a universal definition, the focus of this is to help people maximize their potential and help them to be active learners. So while coaching and mentoring appear to have some similarities at first glance, there's actually just different theories at play here. So Tony Stolfus, who is a pioneer of Christian coaching, explains, he says, when I'm mentoring, I'm teaching a person, letting him draw from me or learn from my experiences. When I'm coaching, I'm pushing a person to draw from his or her own resources and experiences. Coaching is helping people learn instead of teaching them. John Whitmore is another coaching pioneer, and he utilizes the image of an acorn and an oak tree to talk about the idea behind coaching. Contained within an individual acorn is everything that's needed to become a big, strong oak tree. The oak tree-ness is already inside of the acorn, but the acorn needs to be nourished to grow into that potential. Similarly, in the theory of coaching, the individual, the coachee, already has everything that they need within them to thrive. The coach's role is just to nourish and encourage that potential to be realized. So in examining these, I found some intersections. The first is that coaching inherently values the autonomy and independence of the coachee. So coaching might increase the satisfaction of that basic psychological need that can impact well-being. The coach never tells the coachee what to do or makes decisions for the coachee. It is all about the client or the coachee, or in my case, the student, making their own decisions, but the coach walks with them through strategic questioning. The second intersection that I found is this relationship between the coach and the coachee. A coach must be a trustworthy person in a coach's life. And so this needs to be a safe relationship, a safe space. And so this actually can influence that psychological need of relatedness, the increase of social support, and the increase in belonging that impacts well-being. And then a third intersection between emerging adult needs for positive well-being and coaching lies in discovering purpose. And a sense of purpose is beneficial for well-being, and through intentionality, coaching relationships can assist young people and connecting the work they're doing with their larger goals and values. So while many coaching relationships are a formal set up situation between a coach and a client with this contract and agreed upon structure and compensation, coaching relationships are not actually bound to that structure. Whitmore says it's important to stress that it's possible for coaching to be loose and informal, so much so that coaches do not know they are being coached. So coaching principles then can infiltrate the way that professors connect with their students. And he says that coaching is more of this way of life, a way of thinking, a way of being with and managing people. So professors in the Christian undergraduate campus have this unique opportunity to act as informal coaches in the lives of students. They have all of these touch points with students each week throughout the semester, throughout the students' time on campus. They can see that day-to-day life. They can notice when there are changes to behavior. They have time to build trust and longevity in relationship with students to become that trusted social support in the life of a student. So Christian educators who take up the call to informally implement coaching principles into conversations with students will want to understand the parameters of the coaching role so that they don't burn out emotionally and socially. Just like no professor could formally mentor every student, no professor can formally coach every student, but rather a professor who wants to take on these coaching techniques will intentionally listen and affirm students in their God-given gifts and talents and dreams and desires. And I believe that any professor with training can implement and bring informal coaching principles into everyday conversations and interactions with their students. So the first step that professors might take would be to implement some of Springtide's The Belonging process to establish an environment in and outside of the classroom that's conducive to these coaching principles at play. So these 3 levels are noticed, named, and known. So to begin, professors can intentionally notice their students' needs, their aspirations, their frustrations, likes, dislikes, all of these things, even before the classes begin. And they can take the time to make that connection and incorporate those likes, challenges, all of these things into the course content itself. Then professors can work really hard to actually name their students, to know their names, not just in class when they sit in the same seat every day, but in and around campus, to interact with them, make themselves available for conversations, to show a care and a desire to have a relationship with them outside of just, I have information or banking type of education. And then professors can work really diligently to make sure that students feel known, that they know that they are unreservedly accepted by extending hospitality and a judgment-free space. So they can set up a classroom covenant. They can ensure that they're having a hospitable classroom to everyone's interests and bringing all of that into the classroom. And so by intentionally engaging the belonging process, professors can set themselves up as caring and trustworthy adults in the lives of students and set this foundation of noticing the wants and needs of their students, and this paves the way for these coaching interactions to take place. This is going to impact classroom pedagogy. Professors are going to create spaces for connection in the class, places to listen. They're going to alter assignments or the guests or the illustrations they use in class to center on the interests of the students. And they also are going to want to take the opportunity to praise effort over outcomes as emerging adults respond well to this more so than being outcome-based. So Christian colleges and universities need to intentionally seek to improve student well-being, and many universities do this in a lot of ways through campus programs, but they have barriers to utilization. But all professors have access to students, so we can bypass some of those barriers to utilization by thinking about professors building trust and using these informal relationships. So where I want to take this in the future, I want to look into some coaching data on informal and formal coaching. I think mentoring and coaching are both really important. So some sort of hybrid mentor coaching model, what training needs to take place for our professors to engage this, and what sort of incentives do we need to help them to bring this into what they consider part of their job.
Thanks, Stacy. Wonderful. Okay, I wonder. Stacy, where does the coaching of professors begin to impede on the work of student development in higher ed?
Yeah, that's a good question. And one, like higher ed is a lot of these other sort of programs that are geared towards maybe first generation students or BIPOC students. And so I feel like there's more limited touch points and it's more on the student seeking out those opportunities, whereas students must go to class. And so professors have this unique access regularly with students in a way that they can initiate the conversation, which, interesting, with my mentoring research last year, one of the tenets of mentoring relationships was that the onus of the successful mentoring relationships was on the adults to actually cultivate that relationship. And so students being exposed to professors in and outside the classroom and professors intentionally having those conversations, I think is a unique spot that student development doesn't necessarily have.
Mhm. Thanks, Stacy. Maybe one more.
I think it's great. I can chime in. Stacey, a lot of us have written on kind of engaged learning and how do we tackle that in different contexts. I think you bring a helpful and healthy voice to the coaching side is the belonging side, and it's almost put not necessarily secondary, but it pulls down the totem pole a little bit, the right information pipeline, and says, hey, developing whole people is a primary concern. And then, yeah, to what Josh said earlier, right? Maybe that does mean that we need to shift some job descriptions for specifically in higher ed to help create spaces where we're developing whole people.
Yeah. I think the job description idea is, I think, really important. There are a lot of people on like a Christian university campus who like take on that a lot of times the mentoring side just innately because we love the students and we see it as ministry. But I'm also situated in the School of Theology and Ministry, and I know that's not necessarily the case in all of the other departments on our liberal arts campus, that we do definitely still have classrooms that are set up more lecture-based banking education. It is seen as the professors there to provide the education, and that's it. And so I wonder, what does it look like to help all types of professors start to engage in these really intentional conversations?
Stacy, Stephen, Josh, I think you guys should put your heads together, because I do think if you can somehow take this work and like connect it and show that it helps retention, then schools will pay attention to it. Like, you need a metric for that to happen, like that's valued in I think some of the systems, right? Otherwise, I think professed faculty will be like, well, this is one more thing to do, right? And you obviously, you three are creating a great scenario where there's so much more benefits than that. But I do think it'd be interesting to think about, like, what is the institutional value for this? We all see it, but I think it's interesting. Okay, wow, look it's time for a break. How did that happen? It's so good. Okay, so we're gonna take 10 minutes. We've got 3 last but not least people going. We got Jennifer, we got Jean-Paul, and we've got Michael. So let's take 10 and we'll come back and then we'll bring it home, and that'll be great. Okay, so see you in a few minutes. Take a break and we'll be ready to go.